The gleaming spires of the capital city of Zira pierced the amber sky, towering like crystalline daggers. Alexander Reed, Earth's newly appointed diplomat to the SciFi, gazed out the viewport of his shuttle as it descended through lavender clouds. His heart raced with both excitement and trepidation. After years of tense negotiations, this was humanity's first official diplomatic mission to the notoriously isolationist alien civilization. As the shuttle made a soft thud upon landing, Alexander straightened his formal attire, took a deep breath and braced himself. This was the moment he'd prepared for his entire career. He stepped down the ramp, flanked by his small security detail, and was greeted by a delegation of SciFi officials. Their towering, willowy forms loomed over him, iridescent scales shimmering across their blue-tinged skin. Large, almond-shaped eyes regarded him with a cold, unreadable gaze. The lead SciFi stepped forward, inclining his head. "Greetings, Ambassador Reed. I am Zaruk, Minister of Interspecies Affairs. On behalf of Her Majesty Queen Liara, welcome to Exiler." Alexander bowed deeply. "Thank you, Minister. I am honored to be here and look forward to fostering peaceful relations between our peoples." As they made their way to the awaiting hover transport, Alexander marveled at the alien architecture. Spiraling towers of opalescent material stretched skyward, connected by graceful arched bridges. SciFi citizens glided by on personal anti-gravity discs, their robes billowing like sails in the wind. "Your city is breathtaking," Alexander remarked to Zaruk. The alien's face remained impassive. "Zira has stood for over 10,000 of your Earth years. We hope you find your stay illuminating." There was something in Zaruk's tone that sent a chill down Alexander's spine, but he pushed the unsettling feeling aside. He had a job to do. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of meetings and tours. Alexander found himself constantly in awe of SciFi technology and culture, but there was an undercurrent of tension beneath the surface. Many of the SciFi officials regarded him with thinly veiled disdain or outright hostility. On the 5th day of his visit, Alexander was summoned to an audience with Queen Liara herself. As he entered the vast throne room, his breath caught in his throat. The SciFi queen was a vision of alien beauty. Her scales shimmered with an opalescent sheen, and a delicate crown of crystalline spires adorned her head. Alexander bowed low. "Your Majesty, thank you for granting me an audience. I bring greetings and well wishes from—" Before he could finish, Liara's voice cracked like a whip. "Enough," she hissed, her eyes blazing with fury. "You dare show your face after what you've done?" Alexander's mind raced. What? What are you talking about?" Liara's eyes narrowed, her tone icy. "You have committed the gravest crime imaginable. You have planted your vile human seed within me." Alexander gaped, certain he'd misheard. "What? That's impossible. We've never—" Liara's lips twisted into a bitter smile. "I see you remember now. Yes, Ambassador. In a moment of weakness, I allowed myself to be seduced by you. And now I find myself, with child. A half-breed." Alexander's mind reeled as the implications sank in. "Your Majesty, I had no idea. The wine that night. I barely remember." Liara's voice rang out, a mask of cold rage. "That child you carry threatens the very foundations of our society. By our ancient laws, I am unfit to rule. I will be forced to abdicate." Alexander's diplomatic training kicked in as he desperately searched for a way to defuse the situation. There must be another way. Surely the laws can be changed or an exception made. Silence. Liara's voice echoed through the chamber. "I will hear no more of your human platitudes. Guards, take him to the dungeons. His execution will be at dawn." As the guards seized him, dragging him away, Alexander's mind raced. How had this mission gone so catastrophically wrong? And how could he possibly escape this nightmare? The dungeon was as advanced as SciFi technology but no less unpleasant. Alexander paced his cell, the shimmering force field the only barrier between him and freedom. His mind whirled with the implications of what had happened. Not only was his life in danger, but this could spark an interstellar incident between Earth and SciFi. Hours passed, and just as despair began to set in, a figure appeared outside his cell. A young SciFi female, her scales a pale lavender hue, approached cautiously. "Ambassador Reed," she whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "I'm Mira, handmaiden to the Queen. I've come to help you." Alexander approached the force field cautiously. "Why would you risk helping me?" Mira's large eyes brimmed with worry. "Because what is happening is wrong. The Queen's reaction is driven by fear, not justice. And there are those in the court who would use this situation to their advantage." She deactivated the force field. "We don't have much time. Follow me." As they hurried through shadowy corridors, Mira explained in hushed tones. The Queen's pregnancy has caused a political firestorm. Some of the more conservative nobles see it as an opportunity to force her from the throne. They've never approved of her progressive policies. They arrived at a hidden door, concealed behind an ornate tapestry. Mira placed her hand on a sensor, and the door slid open silently. Inside, a group of about a dozen beings, both Sei and human, huddled around a holographic display. Dr. Alina Chin, the lead biologist on the Earth delegation, stepped forward. "Alex, thank God you're all right," she said, embracing him briefly. "We've been trying to figure out how to get to you." "What's going on?" Alexander asked, his mind spinning. "How did this happen?" Kiner, the chief medical officer to the royal family, spoke up. "The situation is unprecedented. There's never been a successful breeding between Sei and another species. Some are claiming it's impossible." Alina nodded. "They're accusing you of trickery or deception." Alexander shook his head in disbelief. "This is insane. There has to be a peaceful resolution." Kiner's expression darkened. "It may not be that simple. The Queen's pregnancy has become a rallying point for multiple factions. Some wish to depose her, others want to sever all contact with Earth. And there are rumors of even darker motives." "What do you mean?" Alexander asked, a knot tightening in his chest. Alina's face was grim. "We've intercepted communications suggesting that elements within both the Sei military and Earth's government see this as an opportunity to provoke open conflict. They believe war is inevitable and want to strike first." Alexander's heart sank. "So what can we do?" "There has to be a way to prevent this from spiraling into war." Liara stepped forward, her voice quiet but determined. "We believe the key lies with the Queen herself. If we can convince her to see this child as an opportunity rather than a curse, she might be able to sway public opinion." "Surely easier said than done," Alexander muttered. "She seemed pretty set on having me executed last time we spoke." Mira nodded. "We'll need to act fast. The palace is on high alert and spies are everywhere." Over the next few days the group worked tirelessly. Alina and Kiner pored over medical data, looking for anything that could be seen as a miracle. Mira used her position in the palace to gather intelligence and set up a secret meeting with the Queen. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of close calls and sleepless nights, they had their chance. Liara arranged a private audience with Queen Liara. As Alexander stepped into the Queen's private chambers, he steeled himself for the most important conversation of his life. Liara was sitting on a low couch, her hand protectively cradling her swollen abdomen. Her eyes narrowed as she saw him. "You have some nerve showing your face here, human," she hissed. "I should call the guards this instant." Alexander raised his hands in a placating gesture. "Your Majesty, please. I beg you to hear me out. What I have to say could change everything." Liara's expression remained cold, but she didn't summon the guards. Alexander took it as permission to continue. "Your Majesty, I know you see this child as a threat to your rule and your people's way of life. But what if it's the opposite? What if this child is the fulfillment of an ancient prophecy?" He laid out the evidence they had gathered, the unique genetic markers, the unprecedented melding of Sei and human traits, and the eerie similarities to the legend of the Star Child. As he spoke, he saw a flicker of something in Liara's eyes, uncertainty, perhaps even hope. "This child you carry," Alexander said softly, taking a cautious step closer, "could be the key to bringing our peoples together. A living symbol of unity and peace." Liara's hand tightened over her abdomen. "A symbol of unity?" Her voice trembled. "Or a symbol of my weakness? My failure to uphold our most sacred traditions?" Alexander took a deep breath. "Traditions are important, Your Majesty. They give us identity and continuity. But sometimes, when the universe presents us with something unprecedented, it's a sign that those traditions need to evolve." He gestured to her swollen abdomen. "This child, our child, is something that has never existed before. It's not just a mixing of our species but a new life form entirely. The medical data shows abilities and potential we've never seen before." Liara's eyes widened, her curiosity piqued despite herself. "What kind of abilities?" "It's still early, but scans show signs of enhanced neural activity far beyond what's normal," Alexander said, his voice steady. "This child could change everything." Liara's gaze softened for the first time. "Could this truly be the change we need?" she murmured. "Yes, Your Majesty," Alexander replied, the weight of his words settling on them both. "Yes, it could." The air in Queen Liara's chambers was thick with tension as Alexander's words hung in the space between them. The flicker of uncertainty in the queen's eyes was small, but it was there, enough to offer a spark of hope. Liara sat in silence for a moment, her hand resting protectively over her abdomen, as if shielding the life within her from the very conversation that might determine its future. Alexander could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. If he failed here, it wouldn't just be his life that was forfeit. It could ignite a war that would consume both Earth and the Sei. After a long pause, Liara finally spoke, her voice low but steady. "And you think that this child, the one I carry, could change the course of history?" "I believe it has the power to do more than that," Alexander said, his voice measured but firm. "This child is more than a mere mixing of our species. It represents the merging of two worlds, a tangible symbol of cooperation and unity. If we can present it as such, if we can demonstrate that this child is the fulfillment of the ancient prophecy, then it could unite both our peoples." Liara's eyes flickered with something close to curiosity, but she quickly masked it. "You speak of a prophecy. A myth?" "It is not just a myth, Your Majesty," Alexander insisted. "There are ancient texts, some of which I've seen during my studies of your people. The Star Child, a being born of two worlds who will bring peace and prosperity, not only to Sei but to all sentient beings. I know it sounds like a fairy tale, but the evidence is undeniable. The unique traits of the child developing inside you, the melding of human and Sei biology, it aligns perfectly with the legend." Liara's expression shifted, the steel in her gaze softening ever so slightly. "And you expect me to believe that this child is the fulfillment of some prophecy?" "Yes," Alexander said, stepping closer, his heart pounding in his chest. "I know it's hard to accept, but sometimes the universe gives us an opportunity to change our fate. This child is that opportunity. Instead of viewing it as a curse, we must see it as a chance to evolve, to bridge the gap between our peoples." Liara remained silent for a long moment, her fingers still gently caressing her abdomen. The silence between them stretched, and Alexander feared it might be too late. But then, just as he was about to speak again, Liara raised her head, her eyes narrowed, but there was a flicker of resolve there. "Even if I were to believe your words," she said, her voice colder now, "there is more at stake than just the future of Sei. My people are deeply divided. The factions within my court, the conservatives, the military, even some of my own advisors, see this pregnancy as a threat to their power. They will use this child to weaken my rule, to force my abdication." "I understand, Your Majesty," Alexander said, lowering his voice to a more empathetic tone. "But you do not have to face this alone. There are those within your court, like Mira, who believe in the potential of this child. There are others on Earth who wish to see peace, not war. We can help you rally your people, show them that this is not a sign of weakness but of strength." Liara's gaze flickered briefly to the door, as though considering what lay beyond it, perhaps the political chaos that awaited her in the palace. The pressure of leadership, of defending her people from those who would see her fall, was clear on her face. "And what of the humans?" Liara asked, her voice now tinged with skepticism. "Do they truly want peace, or is this simply another political maneuver to gain influence over my people?" Alexander paused, the gravity of her question settling in his chest. "Some may see this as a political advantage. But I believe humanity as a whole wants peace. The leaders I have spoken with, including those I trust back on Earth, seek mutual cooperation. The child could serve as a beacon, a way to show both our worlds that peace is not only possible but necessary." Liara's gaze was intense, studying him carefully, weighing his every word. "I will consider your words, Ambassador Reed. But I make no promises. The factions are powerful, and they will not simply bend to your idealism." Alexander nodded, accepting the harsh truth of her words. "I don't expect it to be easy, Your Majesty. But every great change comes with resistance. The key is to show your people that this child, this union between our worlds, is a sign of a future worth fighting for." Liara's eyes softened, though her expression remained guarded. "You ask a lot, human. More than I am certain I am ready to give." "Your Majesty," Alexander said, stepping closer, "this child is not just a product of one night. It is the future. You are not alone in this fight. Let us help you. Let us help both of our peoples." Liara's gaze turned inward, and for a brief moment, Alexander wondered if he had finally broken through the impenetrable wall around her heart. But before he could speak again, a sharp voice broke the silence. "My queen." The voice came from the doorway, and Liara's guards stepped forward, their eyes narrowing as they looked past Alexander. Liara's demeanor hardened instantly. "What is it?" A messenger, one of the queen's most trusted, entered the room, bowing low. "Your Majesty, urgent news." The conservatives in the court are moving faster than we anticipated. They are rallying the military. It seems they've already begun to speak of a preemptive strike against Earth. Alexander's blood ran cold at the words. A preemptive strike? He repeated. You mean they want war? The messenger nodded grimly. Yes, Ambassador. It's only a matter of time before it escalates into open conflict unless something changes. The military is being mobilized and Earth's fleet is already on high alert. The situation is dire. Liara's face tightened with a mix of frustration and helplessness. I never wanted this. I never wanted war. But I cannot control the forces within my own court. Alexander's mind raced. The clock was ticking. Your Majesty, there must be a way to prevent this. If we act quickly, we can stop this before it turns into a full-scale war. Liara stood, her posture regal but with a trace of exhaustion. I will take your words into consideration, Ambassador Reed. But you are right. Time is not on our side. I will need proof, tangible proof, that this child can unite our people, not divide them. Then we will give you that proof, Alexander said, determination burning in his chest. We will show you and your people that this child is the answer to our problems, not the cause. Liara's eyes locked with his, a silent understanding passing between them. Very well. But remember this, Ambassador Reed. The fate of two worlds is now in your hands. As Alexander bowed low, the weight of her words settled deep within him. His mission had gone from one of diplomacy to one of survival. The stakes had never been higher, and the clock was ticking faster than ever before. Outside the Queen's chambers, Mira was waiting. Her eyes were wide with worry, but there was a spark of hope in them too. What did she say? She asked, her voice trembling with anticipation. She's willing to listen, Alexander replied, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. But we need to move quickly. There are factions in her court calling for war, and if we don't convince her that this child is a blessing, an opportunity, then everything we've worked for will be for nothing. Mira nodded grimly, determination in her eyes. Then we'll do whatever it takes to make her see that. Together they left the palace, knowing that their next move would determine the future of both Earth and Sei. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear, there was no turning back now. The sound of footsteps echoed through the palace corridors, their rhythmic beat a reminder of the urgency that had consumed Alexander since his meeting with Queen Liara. His mind raced as he moved through the maze of gleaming walls and intricate arches that defined the heart of Sei's capital. The weight of the galaxy felt heavier with each passing moment. Mira walked beside him, her expression focused but concerned. How do you think the Queen will respond? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know, Alexander admitted, glancing at her. She's more uncertain than I expected. But at least she's willing to listen. That's something. I just hope we have enough time to convince her before the factions move against her, and against Earth. Time is running out, Mira said, her tone tight with anxiety. The military is already preparing for war. The Hawks are pushing for a strike against Earth, and the conservatives in the court want to use this pregnancy to destabilize Liara's rule. The Queen is walking a razor's edge. Alexander nodded grimly. I know. But we can't give up. We've worked too hard to back down now. As they turned a corner, a familiar face emerged from a side corridor. Dr. Alina Chen, the lead biologist from Earth's delegation, her face pale with exhaustion but determined. Alex? Alina called softly as she hurried toward them. I have some news. What is it? Alexander asked, his pulse quickening. Alina lowered her voice, glancing over her shoulder to ensure they weren't being overheard. We've been running more scans on the Queen. There's something strange happening with the pregnancy, more than we first thought. Alexander's brow furrowed. What do you mean? Alina hesitated, then spoke in a hushed tone. The child, it's growing at an accelerated rate. Almost too fast. We've detected neural activity that's far beyond normal for any fetus, even one of Sei's species. The child's brain is developing at an exponential rate, almost as if it's learning, as though it's processing information faster than it should be. And that's not the strangest part. What is? Mira asked, her voice edged with suspicion. Alina took a breath. The child is already exhibiting the ability to communicate in some form. We believe it's accessing the neural patterns of both Sei and human biology. There are signals, almost like flashes of thought, that we're picking up from the scans. It's like it's trying to reach out. Alexander felt a shiver run down his spine. You're saying this child is conscious? Alina nodded, though her eyes were filled with uncertainty. It's too soon to say for sure. We can't be certain of what it means, but it's unprecedented. If this is truly the beginning of something more, it could be the key to convincing the Queen's court that this child is not a curse but a miracle. Alexander thought quickly. If this child is truly as unique as we think, it could turn everything around. We need to present this information to Liara as soon as possible, before her court acts on their own. Alina's face grew serious. There's more. Some of the more conservative factions within SE are already whispering about something worse than just deposing the Queen. They're pushing for a genetic analysis of the child, claiming that if it's not a pure SE, it could be considered an abomination. They're using the ancient laws of SE as their shield, insisting that any mix of species is a violation of their most sacred laws. Mira's face twisted in disgust. That's barbaric. They're willing to kill the child for what it is. Not just the child, Alina responded grimly. If they succeed in pushing Liara out, they'll likely use her as a scapegoat too. The Queen's rule has already been weakened by the growing factionalism, and if she's seen as having failed her people, if the pregnancy is seen as a stain on her leadership, it could cause irreparable damage. Earth's diplomatic efforts will collapse, and we'll have a full-scale war on our hands. Alexander's heart sank. Then we have no time to lose. If we don't act quickly, Liara won't just lose her throne. SE and Earth could be at war before anyone knows what happened. Mira stepped forward, her voice resolute. We need to go to the Queen. Now. If we can show her the truth, show her that this child is the future of both our peoples, we may still have a chance to avert disaster. Alexander nodded, his resolve hardening. Let's move. We have no time to waste. The Queen's chambers were heavily guarded. As they approached, Alexander felt a tightening in his chest. This wasn't just a matter of diplomacy anymore. This was a race against time, a fight for survival, for the survival of the child, for the survival of the fragile peace between Earth and SE. Mira approached the door guards first, speaking to them in hushed tones. After a brief exchange, one of the guards nodded and stepped aside, allowing them to pass. The Queen's chambers were dimly lit, the soft glow of bioluminescent plants casting a pale light on the walls. Liara sat on a low plush cushion near a small table, her regal presence almost overpowering despite the quiet air of uncertainty that surrounded her. Her eyes flickered toward Alexander and his group as they entered, but there was no immediate hostility in her gaze, only a weary, resigned curiosity. I thought I told you, Ambassador Reed, that you were not welcome here, Liara said coolly, though her voice lacked the icy edge it had held earlier. Alexander bowed deeply as he had done before, but this time there was an urgency in his movements. Your Majesty, I know the situation is difficult, but I have new information that may change everything. Information that could prove this child is more than just a threat to your rule. It could be the salvation of both our peoples. Liara raised an eyebrow, her expression unreadable. More information, Ambassador? You test my patience. Please, Your Majesty, he said, taking a step forward. The child you carry, there are things happening inside you that no one could have predicted. The neural activity, the accelerated development. This child is not just a symbol of the future. It is the future. Liara looked at him for a long moment, her eyes flickering with a mixture of doubt and wariness. You expect me to believe that? After everything that's happened? Yes, Alexander said, his voice steady. Because the truth is, this child is already demonstrating abilities that could unite our worlds, abilities that could change the very fabric of both SE and humanity. Liara stood, her eyes narrowing. You ask a lot of me, human. But I am listening. Tell me more. Before Alexander could continue, there was a sudden commotion outside the chamber doors. The sound of hurried footsteps, voices raised in argument. Mira tensed, her hand moving instinctively toward the small communication device at her belt. The factions, Mira whispered, her eyes wide. They're here. Liara's expression hardened, her regal bearing shifting to one of command. Ambassador Reed, she said, her voice low and dangerous, I am listening. But you will need to convince them, not just me. Alexander's heart pounded as the door slid open, and several of Liara's most influential advisors entered the room, their expressions fierce. The time for diplomacy had just run out. Now it was a fight for survival. The tension in the room was palpable as the doors slid open, and Liara's advisors entered, their eyes narrowed with suspicion. They were the most powerful figures in SE, each one a representative of different factions vying for control of the future of their world. The air in the Queen's private chamber seemed to thicken as they filed in, their presence dominating the space with an undeniable weight. Liara's eyes flashed briefly toward the advisors, her expression a perfect mask of regal composure, though a hint of concern lingered in her gaze. The court had arrived, and Alexander Reed knew that their judgments would determine the fate of both Earth and Say, possibly the fate of the galaxy itself. The first to speak was Rallan, a tall, imposing figure whose deep green scales reflected the dim bioluminescence of the room. His eyes, sharp and calculating, flicked toward Alexander with disdain. "Your Majesty," Rallan began, his voice a low rumble, "this human ambassador has overstepped his bounds. It is bad enough that we must entertain this charade of diplomacy, but now we are expected to believe that this child, this abomination, is some sort of blessing? Have we truly come so far from tradition that we entertain such folly?" Beside him, Tira, an elder with pale, almost translucent skin and a crown of delicate crystal spires on her head, spoke next. Her voice was like the whisper of wind through dry leaves, thin and brittle. "We are at a crossroads, Liara. You cannot allow this child to disrupt our society's foundation. Our laws are clear. This mixing of species is not just unnatural, it is an affront to Say's very existence. It threatens the future of our people. You know this." Liara's gaze remained steady, though her hands clenched slightly, betraying the tension within. "I know the laws," she said quietly, "but I also know that sometimes tradition must evolve to meet the challenges of a changing universe." Alexander stepped forward, his heart pounding. His mind raced with the knowledge that the fate of two worlds, Earth and Say, was in his hands. "Your Majesty, please. If I may." His voice was calm, but inside he felt as though the galaxy itself was pressing down on him. "The child inside you is not simply a union of two species, it is something unprecedented. It is not just a symbol of what is possible between our peoples, it is something more. This child has the potential to unite us in ways no one could have foreseen. To bring peace, to end the isolation that Say has lived with for millennia. You have a chance here to create a future no one could have imagined." Rallan's eyes flared with anger. "And what of Say's honor? What of our legacy? This child, this hybrid, is a disgrace. A half-breed will never lead us, Ambassador Reed. You are fooling yourself if you think otherwise." Tira's thin lips curled into a sneer. "The Queen's bloodline must remain pure. This pregnancy is a stain on Say's future." Alexander's voice hardened. "Is it really a stain or a new beginning? I've spoken with Dr. Chen and we've seen the scans. This child is already showing neural activity that goes beyond anything either Say or humanity could achieve on their own. You can't deny that this is something extraordinary." For a moment, there was a flicker in Liara's eyes, just a brief hesitation. But then she turned back to face her advisors. "I will not allow Say to descend into chaos over a matter of bloodlines. The laws are clear. If I carry this child, I am unfit to rule." She spoke with quiet finality, but her gaze flickered toward Alexander, a glimmer of uncertainty behind her regal mask. Before Alexander could respond, a voice cut through the air, a voice full of authority and unyielding power. "Enough." All eyes turned to the entrance of the chamber as a new figure appeared. A tall, broad-shouldered Say male, his scales deep crimson, strode into the room with an air of undeniable power. His sharp, angular features were set in a permanent scowl, and his eyes were full of judgment. This was Zolan, the leader of the military faction and a key player in the ongoing tension between Say's ruling elites. "Zolan," Liara said, her tone betraying a hint of exasperation. "What is this interruption?" "An interruption?" Zolan's voice was cold and unwavering. "This is a matter of Say's survival. Your Majesty, with all due respect, you are a queen of an empire, not a mother. You must understand the consequences of what you have done. This child is a potential threat to our civilization, and we will not allow it to jeopardize Say's stability." Liara's eyes flashed with fury. "You forget yourself, General Zolan. This is my body and my throne to protect, not yours." Zolan's gaze never wavered. "If you are truly concerned with Say's future, you will listen to reason. You cannot rule over a fractured people. This child, this hybrid, will divide us. It will cause unrest, rebellion, and perhaps worse. The military is already preparing for the worst-case scenario. We cannot allow this pregnancy to stand." The room fell into an uneasy silence as the weight of Zolan's words settled over the group. His reputation for unyielding loyalty to tradition and his military influence were not to be taken lightly. If he was willing to act against Liara, it would mean the destruction of everything she had worked for. Alexander's pulse raced, but he knew this was his moment to act. This was no longer about diplomacy. It was a matter of survival. If he didn't succeed here, Say could be lost to war. He stepped forward, his voice firm. "What Zolan says may be true, but there is another side to this. You have a choice, Liara. You can either allow fear to control you and let these factions tear your world apart, or you can choose to see this child as the future. The child is not a symbol of weakness, it is a symbol of strength. A child born of two worlds, bringing them together in a way no one ever thought possible. Liara's gaze softened for a moment as though considering his words. But then, a low voice interrupted her contemplation. Your Majesty, Tira spoke again, her voice laced with venom. The Queen is weak. She has failed, say. Let this be a warning to all who seek to destroy the very fabric of our society. Rallan nodded. Indeed. The child must be eradicated before it causes more damage. Liara's expression turned colder than Alexander had ever seen it. Her eyes hardened like ice. She stood slowly, her regal composure now fully intact. Enough. She turned to face her advisors, her voice cutting through the tension. You speak of tradition and purity, but you fail to see what is right before you. This child is the future of Say and Earth. If you cannot see that, then you are not worthy of advising me. I will not be swayed by fear. Tira's eyes narrowed. You're a fool, Liara. You will regret this decision. Liara didn't respond. Instead, she turned back to Alexander. Prepare yourself, Ambassador Reed. You may have won this battle, but there will be more to come. I hope you are ready for what is to come. As the advisors filed out of the room, their faces full of bitterness and discontent, Alexander let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. We've made it through for now, Mira whispered, her voice tight with relief. But this is only the beginning. The factions will not back down so easily. I know, Alexander said, his voice grim. But for the first time, Liara has taken a step toward the future. Now we need to ensure that the rest of Say sees this child for what it truly is. A new dawn for both our worlds. The storm had only just begun, and Alexander Reed knew that the true fight was yet to come. The corridors of the palace felt colder now, even with the radiant light of Say's twin suns spilling through the high windows. After the meeting, there was little time for respite. The Queen's decision had reverberated through the palace like a shockwave, and her advisors were not the only ones who would take action. The military, the most conservative factions of Say, and even certain elements within the Earth delegation were already preparing for conflict. Alexander Reed, once just a diplomat, now found himself thrust into a deadly game of politics and survival. The child inside Queen Liara, the hybrid, was no longer just a symbol of peace. It had become a flashpoint for war. The moonlit courtyard outside the royal palace was eerily quiet, save for the soft hum of hovercrafts in the distance. Alexander stood on the balcony overlooking the city, his hands clenched into fists. Liara had chosen a dangerous path and he would follow her, no matter the cost. He could no longer afford to be the diplomat. He had to be a warrior for peace. He felt a hand on his shoulder, Liara, the Queen's handmaiden, her lavender scales glowing faintly under the moon's light. You seem lost in thought, she said softly, her voice full of concern. Is everything all right? Alexander turned to her, his expression grave. It's getting worse, Liara. The factions, the military, even some of our own people, they're all pushing for war. We've only bought ourselves a little time. We need to act fast or everything we've fought for will fall apart. Liara nodded, but there was fear in her eyes. I know. The Queen's decision to protect the child has only made things harder. Zolan and Rallan are already plotting to overthrow her. The more conservative leaders see the hybrid as a threat to their power, and now some of Say's generals are calling for a preemptive strike against Earth. Then we must stop them, Alexander said firmly, his voice hardening with resolve. We can't wait any longer. We need to make Say understand that this child is not just a bridge between our peoples, it's a chance for survival. If Say's leadership fractures, there won't be anything left to save. Liara's eyes glistened with quiet determination. I will do what I can to buy us time. I'll help you reach the Queen. She trusts me, and we can still persuade her if she sees reason. The two of them exchanged a silent understanding before Alexander turned toward the door to the throne room. He couldn't afford to waste any more time. He had to make the Queen see that she wasn't alone, that her people could be united through this child. But even as he walked with Liara, the weight of the task ahead pressed on him like an unrelenting storm. The throne room was dark when they entered. Liara stood at the far end, looking out over the city, her back to them. The faint outline of her swollen belly was visible beneath the delicate robe she wore. Despite the power that radiated from her, she looked vulnerable, tired, as though the weight of Say's future had already begun to crush her. Your Majesty, Alexander said gently, his voice cutting through the silence. Liara turned slowly, her eyes narrowing at the sight of him. What is it, Ambassador Reed? Have you come to tell me how I've failed Say again? No, Alexander said, his tone firm but respectful. I've come to help you. This child isn't the end of Say Liara. It's the beginning of something new. Your people may resist at first, but in time they will see it. Liara's expression hardened. Do you honestly believe that, Ambassador? Do you think I am blind to what is happening? The political factions are splitting, the military is preparing for war, and some of Say's most influential leaders are already plotting my downfall. How can a child, no matter how special, unite us? It will only tear us apart. Alexander took a step forward, his gaze unwavering. The child is the future. We have proof, Liara. This pregnancy is unlike anything either of our species has ever seen. The neural activity, the genetic markers, they show that this child could be the key to bridging our worlds, to ending centuries of isolation. You can't let fear control you now. Her eyes flickered with something that might have been hope, or fear. She glanced down at her belly, her hand resting protectively on it, as though trying to comfort herself. I never asked for this, Alexander. I never wanted to become a symbol. I never wanted my people to view me as weak because of a decision that was made in a moment of weakness. It wasn't a mistake, Alexander said gently, his voice softening. This child has the potential to save Say and Earth. We just have to make them see it. Liara's eyes burned with intensity. But can you make them see it? Can you convince Zolan or Rallan or anyone who has already made up their minds? My people are divided. Some would rather see me deposed than accept this child. Then we'll fight, Alexander said, his voice firm with the resolve he hadn't known he was capable of. We'll fight for the future of Say. For the future of both our peoples. Together. Liara hesitated, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of her position was suddenly too much to bear. Then slowly she nodded. I won't abandon my people. I won't let them tear this world apart. If this child is the future, then it's time for Say to change. Time for the universe to change. The next few hours were a blur of frenetic activity. Alexander and Liara worked together, reaching out to allies among the Queen's remaining loyalists. They met with military leaders and neutral factions, pleading their case, warning them of the dangers of war, and trying to convince them that Say's survival depended on uniting with Earth, not destroying it. But as the clock ticked down, the tension mounted. Messages came in from Earth, warning of fleet movements. The military had already begun to mobilize. Both sides were on the brink of war. Finally, the moment of reckoning came. The Great Council, Say's governing body, convened for a final meeting. It was here that Liara would either cement her rule or be overthrown. Alexander stood at the back of the hall, watching as Liara took her place at the center. Her gaze swept over the assembly of Say's elite, and for the first time she did not look uncertain. She was the queen once more, and she would fight for her people and her child. I stand before you today, Liara began, her voice ringing with authority, not as a ruler who has failed her people, but as a mother who sees the future of Say in a way no one else does. This child, our child, will be the bridge that connects our worlds. If we stand divided, we will fall. If we unite, we will rise. The silence in the chamber was deafening. Zolan, the military leader, stood, his crimson scales gleaming in the light. You are a fool, Liara. Your child is a threat to Say's future. It will divide us, destroy us. But Liara held her ground. I will not let fear dictate our future, Zolan. This child is the future of Say and Earth. We will not live in the shadows of our past. We will walk into the light together. A murmur rippled through the council. And then, after what felt like an eternity, the motion passed. Say had chosen its future. As the council disbanded, Alexander felt a weight lift from his shoulders. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time he felt hope. The war had been averted. Say and Earth had taken the first step toward a shared future. Liara's eyes met his across the hall. She nodded once, a small, uncertain smile playing on her lips. It wasn't the end. It was the beginning. And for the first time in his life, Alexander Reed believed that peace was possible.